Tubaaniriza nnyo mwenna ku mukolo guno ogw'okukuza ebikolwa bya baddugavu. Welcome our presenters and attendees to the opening event of the 2022 Black History Month celebration. The City of Calgary recognizes Black History Month in February and moves forward in the journey towards becoming an anti-racist organization. This year's theme is Health and Wellness of Black Lives in the Present, Past, and Future. This theme creates the space for us to rethink how Black health and wellness are shaped by historical realities, present human social conditions, and an envisioned future where colonial legacies are no longer a key determinant of health, wealth, and survival. Rethinking human social conditions requires us to be open to learning new things and sometimes unlearning other things. This is part of the journey of becoming an anti-racist organization and city, and this requires us to attend to self-care. Some of the topics or issues raised in today's conversations may evoke painful memories. This also serves as a reminder to be gentle towards one another, to listen with our hearts as well as our minds, because we are all in this journey together. We welcome our presenters and our attendees in and outside of Calgary to the opening event entitled Why a Black History Month? Shouldn't we be past this by now? We will kick off this event with a territorial acknowledgement. Okay, so I would like us to take a moment and take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nations and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So I would like to take this moment to introduce the next speaker. And our next speaker will be Her Worship Mayor Jyoti Gondek, and it is my honor to introduce the mayor. So allow me to say these few words of introduction about the mayor. Jyoti Gondek was sworn in as Calgary's 37th mayor and the first woman to be elected to this role on October 25th, 2021. Prior to being elected as mayor, she served as city councillor for Ward 3 from 2017 to 2021. She holds a PhD in urban sociology and an MA in organizational sociology. Throughout her career, Mayor Gondek has taken a big picture approach to pressing challenges. Often, she has found processes and policies exist simply because they have never been questioned. She has come to understand that by probing and chipping away at issues, we move forward with improvements that have meaning in our everyday lives. Calgarians face many challenges, including the economic recovery, climate crisis, lack of affordable housing, truth and reconciliation, and women's participation in the labor force. Mayor Gondek believes that solutions to these issues must be bold and rooted in economic, social, and environmental resilience. Throughout her career, Mayor Gondek has been known to be a driven community builder and diversity champion who understands the power of cross-sector partnerships where business, social organizations, and educational institutions are connected to local governments to better serve the people. She is honored to serve Calgarians as Mayor. Welcome, Your Worship, Mayor Gondek. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It is great to be here with you today. Thank you very much to the organizers for putting this event on. The observance of Black History Month this February is our reminder that Black history is Canadian history, and it is also part of our city's history. I'm very thankful to Black Calgarians who helped to shape our city in the past, as well as those who are shaping a future that is inclusive, a future that is diverse and welcoming of all of the stories that define who we are. In 1974, Vernetta Anderson was elected to Calgary City Council, and that was truly a transitional moment for our city. She was compassionate and she was committed. As a member of council, she represented Ward 3 and the city very well. The mayor at the time, Mayor Sykes, said about her, she is intellectual, she's honest, and she is one who speaks with common sense. It was an absolute privilege to be elected in the same ward decades later, knowing that Vernetta Anderson's legacy actually paved the way for me to enter into public service. Now, although there is much to celebrate when we reflect on stories like that of Alderman Anderson's, we also have to remain aware that there is still a lot of work to do. We recognize that Black Canadians experience health and social inequities linked to processes of discrimination at multiple levels of society, including individual, interpersonal, institutional, and societal discrimination. And although Alberta has the fastest growing Black Canadian population, a 2016 survey found that relative to the national average, a higher proportion of Black individuals live in low-income environments, they face lower levels of employment, and they achieve lower levels of education, as well as facing a distinct wage gap. These facts contributed in part to City Council advancing a commitment to becoming an anti-racist city back in 2020. We need to address the issues of inequity that arise from systemic racism. Our administration is assessing the policies, the services, and practices that we currently have in place so that everyone can access all city services without discrimination based on the color of their skin or their country of origin. For my part, I am committed to action that is driven by education and informed perspectives. I am grateful to people like Dr. Melinda Smith and Dr. Minetta Bailey. They are both scholars and advocates who have shared with me their lived experiences as Black women, as well as provided recommendations to me on how to tackle the incredibly heavy work before us as we try to be an anti-racist city. I am grateful to people like Simone Elizabeth Saunders and Lonray Ajayi, who have shared their creative talents with Calgarians in a brilliant effort to use the arts and culture as a means of education. And I am very grateful to have had a friendship with an amazing human being named Noelle Fogo Lamoureux, who used to tell me her own stories of growing up Black in Alberta. She also told me about her sister, who is a historian and a filmmaker, one who had spent years documenting the story of John Ware. To have then gone on to meet her sister, Cheryl Fogo, and attend the Calgary Film Festival in 2020 and see John Ware reclaimed, I really don't have the words to capture how that impacted me. I had not known anything of John Ware. I did not know the history of Black people in Calgary and the racism they encountered and the battles they fought to create a more equitable city. Thank you to members of Calgary's Black community who have helped to educate me on our history and what is needed for our future to be inclusive. And I want to offer a special thank you to Councillor Courtney Walcott, who similarly provided me with an insightful perspective on his experience with Black Lives Matter and his lived experience as a Black Calgarian, well before he ever contemplated running for council and winning his seat. We are better served as a city because Courtney is in the public service. For Calgary to truly be a resilient and welcoming city, we must take meaningful action to address disparities within our communities. We are off to a strong start with our anti-racism program team, who have engaged over 2,000 members of Indigenous and racialized communities to share their recommendations for how Calgary can become a place to call home, free of racial discrimination and racial bias. But this is only a start, and we must all remain committed to continued action. Racial inequities are driven by historic injustices. Without a retelling of history, a retelling that brings in the missing actors, the narrative remains colonial and one-sided. Together, let us rewrite the history of Calgary. We will build on the legacy of mothers and fathers who gave up their dreams and sacrificed much, the people who marched, the ones who voted, those who were at public hearings on systemic racism, those who conduct anti-racism research, and those who died advocating for equitable access to all, to healthcare, to education, and to employment. This Black History Month, let's come together and celebrate Calgary's Black community with a renewed hope. Thank you so much for having me here with you today.
Thank you very much, Your Worship, for that inspiring message. Now, we would like to welcome Katie Black, General Manager of Community Services with the City of Calgary, to speak next. Allow me to also share a few words about General Manager Katie Black. Community Services is the department that connects and protects people, provide wide and diverse variety of programs for Calgarians, from public safety to play, and including the anti-racism section. Community Services also works collaboratively with more than 600 community associations, civic partners, and non-profits to fulfill a shared mission of creating and sustaining a vibrant, healthy, safe, and caring community with Calgarians. In her 30 years of public service, Katie has championed the city's social well-being agenda, inspired by council, colleagues, and citizens in initiatives like This Is My Neighborhood, the Investing in Partnerships policy, Fair Entry, and the Seniors Age-Friendly strategy, as well as our work in mental health and addiction, and of course, anti-racism, just to name a few. As Katie says, the whole is always greater than the sum of the parts, and collective impact is how we are at our best. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you, Faisal, so much. Good afternoon, Your Worship, and thank you all for celebrating Black history with us. This month has been designated as a specific time for us to focus on and recognize that Black history is more than just isolated instances. It's interwoven into the history and the stories of us all as people, as Calgarians. Black Calgarians' public service, intellectualism, entrepreneurship, artistry, and labor helped make Calgary one of Canada's best cities, biggest cities, a great place to live. Black Calgarians have led and continue to lead in a variety of ways in our city. We already heard Her Worship speak about our Ward 8 City Councillor, Courtney Walcott, who petitioned the Calgary Board of Education to form an anti-racism task force. His path was paved by Vernetta Anderson, whom we also heard Her Worship speak about, the first Black person ever elected to serve on City Council. I'd like to also call out Lemlem Haley, one of our community social workers who works with youth experiencing racism, and Haruna Papula, one of our leaders in information technology here at the city. These two city workers give of themselves each day to help make the city a better place to live and work. And while we celebrate these individuals, they give us only a glimpse into the 400-year history of Black people in Canada. The City of Calgary is deeply committed to examining systemic racism and racial discrimination in our organization and in our community. The city's anti-racism program team is listening and learning from those impacted by racism, including what is referred to as living while Black. The goal is to develop concrete actions to address factors that contribute to racism. We're implementing a racial equity assessment to identify core elements of racial inequities in our policies, programs, and services. Working with diverse partners, we are exploring what it will mean to live, work, and play in Calgary without fear of hate-motivated incidents. In partnership with the Anti-Racism Action Committee, we are building an anti-racism community strategy to achieve structural changes to existing inequalities within Calgary. Within our organization, all our executive leaders have started personal journeys to becoming anti-racist leaders. We want an organization free of hate and systemic racism, and we are all committed to walking that talk. We'll continue to improve our policies, putting an anti-racism lens on our services. Celebrating and understanding Black history is a step in that direction. So I invite you to engage in conversation with our speaker, Dr. Carl James. Explore the gaps in the history that you were taught and understand the lingering impacts of being denied one's history and one's presence. Celebrating Black history is not only for this month, it's for every day. Let us ask ourselves some uncomfortable questions and explore our own intersectionality and stories to better understand the complete history of Canada and all its people.
Okay. Thank you very much, Katie, for the inspiring words and for your leadership at the city. It is an honor for us to invite the keynote speaker, Dr. Carl James, to share with us his wisdom and expertise on today's topic. Why a Black History Month? Shouldn't we be past this by now? Allow me to say these few words about Dr. Carl James. Carl E. James holds the John Augustine Chair in Education, Community, and Diaspora in the Faculty of Education, and is also the Senior Advisor on Equity and Representation in the Office of the Vice President of Equity, People, Culture at York University, Toronto. His research interests include examination of the ways in which accessible and equitable opportunities in education and employment account for the lived experiences of marginalized and racialized Canadians. Also, the possibilities and limits to institutional policies and practices in addressing racism and discrimination. And furthermore, the ways in which societal and institutional cultures shape their lived experiences, educational trajectories, and social outcomes. In his work, he articulates a systemic approach to equity, inclusion, and justice, and using disaggregated race data, not the aggregate visible minority data, with attention to Canadian generation status. One of his most recent publications include Color Matters, essays on the experiences, education, and pursuits of Black youth that was published in 2021. Dr. James, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for having me and for having me engage in this conversation that you are going to have. And it's been suggested, Your Worship. Thanks very much for that welcome and all that welcomed me. Good afternoon. It is worth reflecting on the fact that I have been invited to speak to you in the month of February, mostly because we have all, or most of us, have come to accept, appreciate, or tolerate the fact that February has been designated Black History Month, and as a time and space when we can talk or are permitted to talk about Black people's presence in Canada and about experiences with racism and trauma. Indeed, I observe on your website that for the first time, the city's, I'm quoting, the city's anti-racism program team will be observing Black History Month with presentations from February 9th to 28th. And the observance of Black History Month is under the city's theme, Health and Wellness of Black Lives in the Past, Present, and Future. And Linda Cognettman is quoted as saying, this is an opportunity to address systemic racism, the residual effects of colonialism, and its implication for the health and well-being of Black Albertans, while also moving the discussion towards changing the future. Building on this idea, this Black History Month might also be a time when we want to hear the stories of Black people's experiences, and hence we are given platforms or invited to tell our stories. And it's probably one of the few times when the question, what about? Filling other racialized and marginalized groups whose issues are to some extent very legitimate and yes, need to be raised. But sometimes I wonder when that idea of what about, as some colleagues would say, what about isn't, is raised. I will not deviate from my talk to talk about the idea of what about isn't, but suffice to say that it's interesting to note sometimes the what about not only raises questions about the intersection, but it also sometimes raises questions of trying to deviate the discussion or quell the discussion. But in attempts to resist the construction of Black history as an occasion or as the only time or space permitted to talk about our presence in Canadian society as Black people, or as a period more so since 2020, when the visible minority aggregate is disaggregated and the particular circumstances of African Canadians is acknowledged and given some attention, we work and look forward to this discussion despite our trepidations at times. And we know we do this in a context where multiculturalism is being promoted. And I always think of multiculturalism as how we promote culture and sometimes not want and see more culture than race, when sometimes we use culture to identify race because we want to see ourselves as a colorblind society. The fact is, Black History Month for many serves as an occasion to reflect on Black presence, and I do welcome the opportunity to contribute to the conversation that might be pursued as we contemplate on the political, economic, educational, cultural, and social situation of African Canadians and African Calgarians in particular. Indeed, as Linda Cognettman suggests, I aim to help, quote, create the space for open conversations about the legacy and achievements of Black people in Canada and elsewhere. But as I engage in this conversation, I would like to share with you a number of questions that constantly surface for me whenever Black History Month comes around and I'm invited to engage in conversation. Many of you might have seen some of those questions in the abstract that might have been circulated, but I will pose some of these questions again. What does it mean to have a month devoted to Black history? What's the point of Black History Month? What is Black history? Is it that we do not? Is it that we have been omitting Black history in what has been presented to us as Canadian history? Is that possible? Is there a difference between what is presented as Canadian history and Black history or African history? And the mayor did point to that, to answering that question when she said that Canadian history or Black history is Canadian history. So that question is already answered. And I want us to think about why we had to come about and think about, and what's missing in what is considered Canadian history that has not been featuring the experiences and contributions of Black people. After raising this question, I suggest that until the incomplete history of Canada is acknowledged, then the presence of Black people in Canada or African Canadians become mainstream or normalized in the main history courses that take up, then systemic racism will continue be what will erase Black people's presence in the history that's told. And it will appear that we'll constantly want this special space and time to talk about Black people's presence in Canada. But I don't think we should go on this way. We should be using the month differently because that history would have been known. And the history is not just for African Canadians to know, but it's for all Canadians to know. And it is true that that Canadian history, that incomplete history that's Canadian, have failed to also talk about the contributions and the presence and significant position of Indigenous Canadians. It has failed to talk about Asian, South Asian, and other marginalized groups in that main history. So therefore, we need to reconsider and rethink. My questions are prompted by my attempts to encourage a rethink of Black history as an occasional month, but to think of it differently and think of what we need to use the idea of Black History Month to do in order to work towards making the society a more equitable one and as you have been said, make City Hall much more anti-racist. Recall that it was Carter Woodson, a historian and author in 1933, author of the book Miseducation of the Negro, he launched the Negro History Month. Woodson contended then that the teaching of Black history or recognition of the presence and contribution of Black people in the society was essential to ensure the physical and intellectual survival and well-being of the Black population. Of course, he was talking of the American context. Woodson wrote, "If a race has no history, it has no worthwhile tradition. It becomes a negligible factor in the thought of the world, and it stands in danger of being exterminated." Indeed, Canada, as in the United States, there's a need to recognize, record, report and tell of Black people's presence and their contributions to the societies. This need inspired Canadian Negro Women's Association in 1957 to bring Negro History Week to Canada. And since then, and more so in the 1970s, African Canadians and others throughout Canada have been engaging in naming Black presence and contributions to Canada during the month of February. And it was in 1996 that the Honorable Jean Augustine, Grenadian-born and the first African Canadian woman in 1993 to be elected to the Canada's federal parliament, moved a motion in the House of Commons that brought Black History Month officially to Canada and recognized throughout Canada. And the motion was unanimously accepted by all parliamentarians. But the question still remains, why February? Is it that Carter Woodson's vision of February and his choice of February applies to the Canadian context? Sometimes the question of Black history is observed, when we question whether Black history should be observed in Canada, others have challenged and brought up other things, because in England, Black History Month is in October. And reflecting on the idea of February, Globe and Mail article in 2002, written by Sandra Martin, and she wrote, "It's time to rewrite Black History Month," said it was going to celebrate Black History. If we're going to celebrate Black History Month, we should have our dates and facts. The significant date for Canadians is the history of slavery is 1793 and not 1863. 1973 is the year when Upper Canada Abolition Act was passed under Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe. The act was passed in 1833, 40 years before the British government abolished slavery in the empire. That law came into effect in August 1st, 1834, which makes August, rather than February, a much more significant month to celebrate anti-racism in Canada. We will not cover whether it's February or August, but the fact is, and I'm quite sure, lots of African Canadians welcome the opportunity to be able to engage in the discussion, but with some conundrum. And that conundrum has to do with, should we participate? Why encourage this limited discussion in a month? Writing about this conundrum, Dr. Althea Prince in 1996 wrote an essay, Black History Month, a multicultural myth, or have Black History Month kit will travel. And she wrote, "We do it in the name of community and history, for our children, for ourselves, for our society. We want to see our faces, hear our voices, read our words, speak them. We want our children to do those things too. We seize opportunities to share who we are, explore where we come from, discuss where we're going. Black History Month is such a time when such a space is open." And Dr. Sam Tetley, a sociology professor at the University in Toronto, says that the way in which Black people are expected to take up this month in terms of the progressive narrative, like how far have we've come, is not only exhausting, but counterproductive. And earlier this afternoon, I was talking with two Black high school students who were planning their Black History Month event. And they were very deliberate in saying to me that, I'm quoting that, "We don't want to talk about Black people's experience with pain and trauma. They wanted to talk about Black resilience, celebration, and joy. These students were asking that we critically reflect on what we think represents Black experiences as we talk about and hear about their lives in Canada." And communicating the meaning of the month in an article on February 4th, 2021, Ready for Revolution wrote, "The time has passed for us to engage in what this month has come to represent. We can look as recently as the liberation of Black Lives Matter to see an example of how Black political agenda can be stolen and repurposed. In less than 10 years, we've gone from fighting white folks about the meaning of the phrase to seeing it plastered across billboards and city streets. Black Lives Matter once filled a specific purpose, but has outlived that purpose and threatens almost to squander the radical potential that is fighting to outlive it. The great month that Carter G. Woodson established to raise the political consciousness of his people and instill still a feeling of pride has been weaponized against us. The fact is, Black History Month might be one of the few opportunities we are able to bring to discussion issues pertaining to the underrepresentation of Black people in professional fields and upper level position in our workplaces. to talk about their high unemployment and underemployment rate in these workplaces, and to talk about their limited access to health care and special services, the absence of safe and fulfilling employment that they should have, and the racial profiling of Black people by security officers and police, and of course the high rates of incarceration that they experience. In short, Black people's experiences with systemic racism and discussion. Also think here of CBC's report last December of the Sudanese community members called for urgent action because of the death of their young people. The report said that the Sudanese community in Calgary is struggling with a growing number of its young people winding up in jails or dying from avoidable causes. That Black History Month has been recognized for 26 years, and before that, African Canadians have been referenced in the month, picking up on the American celebration. The questions still remain. How has the recognition of Black History Month been helping, and how far has it taken us since Jean Augustine brought it up 26 years ago? Here in the city of Calgary, will the recognition of all celebration of Black History Month make a difference and contribute to the cultivation of a political and work environment in which African Canadians are feeling safe, respected, and a sense of belonging so that they're able to fully participate? And given the murder of African-American George Floyd that precipitated the establishment of equity and anti-racism task forces with their reports of findings, unconscious and anti-oppression and anti-Black racism training, cluster or targeted hires of Black and Indigenous people, funding of programs, and having a whole number of equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives, will they change things? Are we going to see any difference? And how long would we have to wait for those differences to materialize? In thinking through these questions, we should have the evidence of how the city understands equity, diversity, inclusivity, and I would add justice. The fact is we need to take time to examine the situation of African Canadians and to work towards making the city much more receptive of their present. The mayor identified earlier the situation that calls for Calgary to address and the anti-racism ideas that exist that the city will try to address. So I can expect, and of course, I'll check in again to find the movements that would have taken since then. Reminding us of the situation of African Canadian is a national study by York University Canadian Race Relations Foundations joined together. And that national study report says a snapshot of the Black experience in Canada. And that tells us that almost all Black Canadians surveyed, 96%, say that racism is a problem on the job, with 78% believing that it is a serious problem. In contrast, less than 1 in 5 white Canadians are of the same belief. According to Statistics Canada, Black men earn 66% to every dollar compared to white men. While Black Canadians comprise 3.5% of the national population, Black inmates make up an overview of incarceration of 8.6% of incarceration, and that was 2017. Black women are more likely than white women to be unemployed and underemployed, despite having the same high levels of education. And 8.8% of Black women with university degrees are underemployed, compared to 5.7% of white women with high school diplomas. In that survey, one respondent was quoted as saying, "I recently quit my job of over 20 years, partly due to burnout brought on by discrimination. I guarantee you, if I'd been a white man with only a few years of service, the organization would have thrown me a virtual goodbye party and sent gifts. I did not even get a card. Another respondent said, as a Black man, I have to be cognizant of the things I do and where I go, so appearance matters. I have pink, lime green, polka dot blue and white mask so I don't look menacing. I want to take a lot of that stigma and risk out as best as I can. There's certainly no question that the full historical and contemporary narrative of Canada must be told. But it has to be one narrative and must be inclusive of Canadians of all ethnic and racial groups, starting with the peoples of Turtle Island, followed by others who have come since. This mainstream Canadian history that everyone should know and come to recognize should be, and not simply told or heard during a designated month. Until such time then, our observance of Black History Month are going to be often filled with we're going to use it to fill in the missing materials that our lives as African Canadians bring to the society and to the society, to Calgary in this case in particular. And I think here of the recent $10 bill that was brought about. Professors Jonathan Rose and Barbara Crow of Queen's University, referring to the $10 bill, called the bringing into being of that $10 bill a turning point in Canada's narrative. They wrote, they suggested that the selection of Viola Desmond for the $10 bill was part of, and they were part of a panel that brought that in. And they saw, but so limited is the knowledge or education of most Canadians about Viola Desmond that when it was announced on December 8th, 2016, that the image of Viola Desmond would be on the new $10 bill, very few Canadians, even students in Nova Scotia, her home province, knew about her. One news media noted that countless Canadians erroneously identify the iconic woman who helped put the end to a Jim Crow law in Canada as the inventor of a zipper, a world champion curler, or a famous brain surgeon. Others identified her as someone who killed lots of Germans, and a great actress, and another saw her as a great actress of the silent movie era. But others who had knowledge of Desmond's civil rights activities referred to her as Canada's Rosa Parks, the American icon. Well, there is some similarity to Parks. If Canadians had better knowledge of Canadian history, then it would have been said that Rosa Parks is Canada's Viola Desmond. For the incident at Roseland Theatre in Halifax, where Desmond insisted on sitting in the downstairs area of the theatre, occurred on November 8th, 1946, while Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat in the colored section of the bus to a white passenger occurred on December 1st, 1955, 10 years after Viola Desmond. But Viola Desmond's action was not the first or only Canadian woman in Nova Scotia to push back against racist segregation. For in 1941, Carrie Best and her son were removed from the same theatre for sitting in the white-only section of that theatre. And then we hear about John Weir. But I want to add also, we should also know about Charles Daniels. In 32 years before Rosa Parks in 1914, the same year Viola Desmond was born, Charles Daniels was similarly denied entry into a Calgary theatre because of his race. Daniels' case differs from others in that he won his lawsuit. Daniels worked as a porter assisting passengers on the Canadian Pacific Railroad, one of the few positions that Black Canadians could attend at the time. On February 3rd, 1914, Daniels purchased 2 main floor tickets for the Sherman Grand Theatre to see Shakespeare's King Lear with a friend, but he was denied entry into the main floor and was told he could exchange his tickets for one in the colored section in the balcony. Daniels refused to sit in the balcony and afterwards launched a court case against the theatre, arguing that since he was sober and well behaved, he was entitled to sit anywhere in the theatre regardless of creed or color. He requested $1,000 in damages, or the equivalent of $20,000 today, and highlighted the embarrassment he suffered that evening because there were a number of men in the department of the Canadian Pacific Railroad who had seen him in the lobby at the time, and conductors and in his crew. So he having not been able to enter, that made him stand out. When Daniel's lawyer was asked by a Black person why a Black person would be denied entry to the theater, William Sherman, the proprietor of the theater, said, "I might as well tell it. Regarding the colored people, our audience objects very much. I like their money as well as anyone else's, and it is not for that I object, but the audience complains." These stories of Canadian segregation practices in Canada belie the fact that while there are no official laws enforcing segregation of Black from white, communities and businesses and shops and theaters and restaurants operated with these unofficial rules in the segregation way. I mentioned that Charles Daniels worked as a porter on the railroad. In fact, in his recent book, They Call Me George, the untold story of train porters and the birth of modern Canada, Cecil Foster reminds us about the sacrifices of railroad porters and the vital role they play in the development of Canada's social and physical infrastructure as related to transportation. And in his article, How Black Train Porters Helped Put Canada on Track, which was published in the Globe and Mail in 2019, Foster writes of how the Black porters, many of them immigrants, mostly from the Caribbean, kept rail travel running smoothly in Canada, and they paved the way for racial justice and economic opportunity for all. He said that they left a legacy of social change in Canada and as part of civil rights movement, and indeed the entire Black experience in the Americas and beyond. Continuing with the story of the train porters and referring to Stan Grizzell, someone from whom many of us in Toronto would have known and have come to admire, Foster further writes, following the Second World War, Mr. Grizzell and his fellow porters fought to create a new Canada by embodying citizenship that reflected the diversity and dignity of humanity itself. The battle to normalize what is now routine and even taken for granted and in our daily living. Black workers holding a wide range of jobs, including civil service positions, and Black people from Africa and the West Indies migrating and becoming citizens of Canada. Against great odds then, the sleeping car porters sacrificed themselves and all they had. They turned Canada black, brown, and a host of other shades. Yet this important piece of Canadian history has yet to be fully told. Foster also makes the point that Canada became the official multicultural society that it is known to become because of the pioneering work of the railroad porters and the still not fulfilled dreams of Black people, such as Mr. Grizzell, who at one time were only allowed to hold jobs as sleeping car porters. And on Sunday, January 16th, CBC carried a news report reminding us of the history of the historical importance of January 15th. The article had a headline, Nova Scotia pays tribute to Black loyalists who sailed to Sierra Leone in 1792. It was on January 15, 1792 that 15 ships carrying 1,196 Black loyalists left Halifax for Sierra Leone. The article started in the dead of winter, say 230 years ago. Saturday, nearly 1,200 loyalists set out on a daunting journey from Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone. What the seafarers endured and fought for is just as relevant today as it was on January 9, 1792, says high school student Zion Ash. That was part of his project to mark the historical exodus of Black loyalists from Nova Scotia and remember its legacy to Nova Scotia. And that student went on to say, I know that they fought for our future and they struggled to make things better for us. It was ironic for me that weekend when I was experiencing what January 15 meant in Canada, and at the same time, hearing and knowing that on the other end of Canada, namely in Vancouver, students in the schools there were celebrating Martin Luther King's Day and his birthday. And I was wondering, how much did they know about the Nova Scotia Black loyalists? And was there ever mention of that as they celebrated Martin Luther King's Day? And of course, there was no such mention, obviously, because this is an evidence of how the history of our society is not known or is not mainstream. So it's in this context then that we welcome the city of Calgary's vision to bring about an anti-racist city. And I've read of that vision, and it says, the strategy helps the city to recognize its vision of Calgary, a great place to make a living, a great place to make a life, and its common purpose of making life better every day. The strategy declares to employees and citizens that council and administration are committed to building and strengthening an equitable, diverse, and inclusive organization. It is in this sentiment that some colleagues and I, and working with and having funding from the Royal Bank of Canada, working on a project we called Securing Black Futures. And Professor Jennifer Adams, who works at the University of Calgary, and she's working with others of us, myself in Toronto, Juliette Daniels at McMaster in Hamilton, Kevin Hewitt at Dalhousie University, and Annette Henry at University of British Columbia. She's working with us in helping to change lives and enable and support the educational aspirations of Black high school students and university students in terms of fulfilling their aspirations and their potential. As Professor Jennifer Adams says, the research indicates that Black students are not pursuing STEM, science, technology, engineering, and in the engineering program, and they're not going through STEM in the same numbers as their white and other racialized counterparts. Second and third generation Black students succumb to the systemic issues that pose challenges in their pursuits of higher education, particularly in STEM. And so because of the deficit orientation narratives that's communicated to these students, they might not pursue sciences as a program. Hence, Dr. Adams' project here in Calgary aims at developing leadership and communication skills in Black students, particularly in the area of STEM. She seeks to foster a wider engagement in STEM for Black secondary students and university students, expose them to scientists who look like them, and because they're exposed to scientists who look like them, they can imagine themselves and visualize themselves as scientists. Indeed, Canadian society will be more enriched with the diversity of researchers who will produce and research things that will lead to greater innovation and broader applicability and equitable programs for the diverse population of Canada. I know I should be ending, so I'll move towards ending. But before ending, let me talk about one of the things I've observed in a number of institutions recently. Has to do with the establishment of task forces, the establishment of town hall conversations and listening sessions, and we notice hiring that's taking place, and all these have been taking place since 2020 June, with the murder of African-American George Floyd. We have seen that stimulated people paying attention to how racism has been operating. And this is not just in Canada, but around the world and in England, as the case may be. But we have to think about then that it's not just, we cannot always be taking cues from elsewhere, because what we need to think that our situation in Canada and racism in Canada is just as important to pay attention to. Some conversations I've had with people who have said that other Black people have been killed and other Indigenous people have been killed by police officers, and there have been demonstrations all along, but we haven't seen these kinds of reckoning with race and racism before George Floyd. And so the people grappling with, is this short term or is this long term? But there's no doubt that the activism of Black, Indigenous, and other racialized people, and others who join in that kind of engagement, they have helped to bring about what institutions are doing today. And it's not just simply saying that they have not been working hard throughout the years at these things. And we have to think that institutions cannot just simply adopt a rhetoric of inclusion and diversity because, as Jeffrey McMaster says, we have to challenge and change the values, structures, and behaviors that perpetuate systemic racism. And on the night right, discourses of inclusiveness and diversity usually remain at the rhetorical level. Using these terms gives the impression an institution is being progressive, when in actual fact it may not be. We need to move past rhetoric and symbolic statements about being in solidarity with people who experience racism. And in closing, I want to reference what Gregory Frankson writes in an essay. For Black Canadians, there's no going back to the way things were. He writes, huge numbers of people suddenly had a burning need to be seen aboard the Let's Help Black People bandwagon. That explosion of energy in the second half of 2020 managed to carry us all the way through 2021. Now with George Floyd's fading into history and corporate EDI boxes checked off, Black Canada's 15 minutes of fame are almost up. The Black community has almost known its moment and has come and will be going. Eventually, it was said in community circles, people will tire of talking about our issues and sick of actively confronting our challenges. They simply don't have the stamina that our history and experiences have forced us to develop. It's easy for people who aren't Black to walk away from a cause that doesn't affect their daily lives, then relegate these concerns to the fringes of the awareness in favor of the latest hot topic. For us, focus is a means of survival, advocacy a vital necessity, and silence a death sentence. We will keep at it, but will they be willing to listen, much less act, once our cause is no longer fashionable? Finally, if the recognition or celebration, as it's often used, is of Black History Month, is supposed to help us remember the past and to change things, then how we remember is important. Because we must bear in mind that remembering is informed by our respective experiences, our socializations and learning, as well as what we're willing to accept of the past and our role or the role of earlier generations in that past. Remembering the past or the history that we construct or is constructed for us must take into account the new knowledges that we bring to the history. And as writers Walkman and Hansen said, right in the book, to remember is to reconstruct in the present moment a past, not what as it was once was, but as it is considered now by the rememberer in light of all that has happened since. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carl James, for that, for sharing your wisdom and expertise, as well as laying the foundation for all of us to begin this journey of unlearning and relearning. You touched on a lot of important points and been taking notes, and it is really, really very inspirational. It is very educative, and I really look forward to the next section of our event, whereby we can then field some questions that we have received from the audience. Now, the first question, Dr. James, is a question that really touches on what Diane Brand in her article she wrote about it. It's the reckoning, reckoning, repairing and rewilding, and reckoning in terms of holding to account the narratives, and you really mentioned that. And the question from the audience is like is as follows. You mentioned whataboutism. I encounter this with a lot of people I care about, in-laws, and so on. And I'm often unsure how best to be an ally in those moments. Do you have any advice on how to respond to whataboutism, right? Or when people ask, what about other months or months for other people? So what would be your recommendations, your advice, your response to that?
Thank you. Thanks for the question. Like I said, what about sometimes and is legitimate question, and it's often a legitimate question that must be put forward there. And so sometimes I don't always dismiss it, but I would always want to see what might have prompted that question. Is it to say, okay, but we can't deal with all of you guys. We have only some limited resources, so we have to prioritize. So therefore, how are we going to set up that priority? Or is it simply to say, okay, we have to see how intersections might be happening, how it's race, but also how race intersect with income, etc., etc. The mayor earlier talked about the low income situation that black young people experience and so forth. So for me, then, it's not to dismiss it, but engage the person who asks that to see how genuine it is, to really want to open it for everybody and really work at everybody's. Or is it to close down the operation? Because sometimes if we're asking that question because it's limited resource, you're going to say, well, only certain people can have access to that resource. And, it's, one thing I think about is how much that question sometimes is trying to say, put a hierarchy in terms of who is more deserving compared to others and in what context. So I'm always concerned about how that's brought about and why that question. But again, that's not to dismiss the question, but to engage the question in a critical manner, to have people reflect seriously and critically on their question.
Thank you very much, Dr. James, for that response. And there's a lot to learn and there's a lot to unpack. And truly, one of the challenges that I have encountered myself, of course, is the allyship part. And you're right, not just even in terms of race, but in terms of other intersections. And so thank you so much for pointing that out. Because as you have mentioned, the history, Canadian history, is a collective history. And so the next question that I have from the audience also has something to do with those intersections as well. And so the question really is, I can understand Black people not wanting to focus on pain and trauma, but I worry that we haven't dealt with our trauma either and are suffering from the health consequences as a result. Any thoughts on how we as Black people can work towards healing as a community?
Absolutely. It's yes, but any group of human beings are going to have those trauma, pain, etc., etc., and we're going to have to talk about it. But you see, what we want is not that. That's not all of us. That's not all of all our being. We're more than that, or we're human, just like others are. And therefore, it's not just simply saying yes, that it's trauma. So it's not to dismiss it, but it's to not just see us as victims of racism, but active participants in creating our world and creating the society in which we live. And also, I totally agree that for communities of Black people, we have to also engage, work collectively on the process of healing and responding, and how we respond is going to be important. But of course, and we have to do it coming together. And yes, but that's not to say that others should not also be doing the work that they have to do in order to support the work that we do on ourselves. So, and that's bigger discussion that we need to have about how might those communities of Black people work together to also work at issues that we need to work at in order to make our lives in the Canadian society, and in this case Calgary, much more welcoming and supportive of our presence.
Thank you very much once again, Dr. James, for that wonderful response. And it also brings to me that, you know, it raises that a very, very important point of how do we deal with this intergenerational trauma. And by we, I don't only refer to Black Calgarians or Black Canadians, but the Indigenous people, other groups as well, because there is something about repairing the brokenness. There's something about healing that actually, when there is ways, when there are supports for people to really come together and heal together, there is a way that it can help sustain and actually be sustainable in itself. So really, thank you so much for that response. And I believe that, you know, one of the things you mentioned and struck me is that we are more than the pain, right? That we shouldn't allow Blackness to be reduced to what was then deemed to be unworthy, that definition, we shouldn't allow it to be the final vocabulary of what Black is, but that we were always more than that, and we should be more than that. We're more than the pain. And I think that is what it is that is, in a way, you know, it can help bridge the gap. It can help create that foundation. So thank you so much. Another question that we got from the audience is, and this really ties back to the response you gave. How are the stories of Black people going to help address systemic racism?
I think of the stories of helping to address systemic racism as, first of all, I always think of, you know, systemic racism is not out there. Systemic racism is made up of the individuals' attitudes, individuals' ideology, etc., etc. I think also of how institutions have certain programs and policies that's maintained because of racism. But more importantly for me is how society itself breathes and cultivates and has racism as its underpinning. For example, and I gave the example, if Canadians know so little about those 1,196 Canadians, the African Canadians who went back to Sierra Leone, you know, if we knew about those people, it's not just that missing out of the book, the history book. The history book also would have been encouraged and developed by governments and supported by government, by funding. It would have come out of the larger society. So it's not just to look at individual, but to look at how this institution itself weighs or misses or fail to take into account everyone's experience and everyone's situation, and how the society itself pushes a sense of not taking into account the presence of Black Canadians and our contribution. So if that's missing, if that's not taken into account in the larger society, if the media only will present Black people in only one kind of light, and if the institutions that we are part of only understand the Blackness in one way, then individuals are going to develop those kinds of ideas. So when I mentioned Dr. Adams wanting Black students to be in Calgary and to get into the STEM programs, their presence not being in the STEM program, it's not so much that they might not have chosen to, but did we, and did the institution, the school system, really deliberate go about working at getting Black teachers so students can see Black teachers in science and think of themselves as being able to get there? So systemically, for me then, it's always the important way to go. See how the system is enabling or disabling the stories that we need to report on and not getting communicated to young people. So systemic racism is where we should go. It's not individual only, but it's all these players within our society. And we have to think about how the society create the situation where we have inherited today. I hope I did answer that question.
Yes, you did. Thank you very, very much. And your response, Dr. James, really reminded me of that a lesson that lesson I learned during my grad studies, that the stories we live by, the histories that we are inhabiting, that history is not so far back as we imagine. And so, and you mentioned that from a systemic point of view, that it is important to uncover, to explore, to understand how a system is enabling and disabling the stories. Because when the system can actually do that, then we are on a repeat mode of what we are trying to dismantle, and that is very good. And that's why I think for the city of Calgary and for the anti-racism program as well,
Could I say?
Please.
Could I add to that? Because I'm thinking of, for example, I was thinking of how the system create some of the situation we find ourselves. I'm thinking of how do we imagine in certain people's position, how do we imagine who is the person best suited for that position? So if a Black person has never been in the position, or we've never seen, we might never have imagined that position is possible. And if a Black person is found in a particular area that they've never been in that area, we have to think about, and I get this all the time from students who would say to me, listen, and they've been in places where people say, are you supposed to be here? Because they did not imagine that person being here. And the reason by that person might not have been imagined in that space is because we've never presented that person's bodies in those spaces. And therefore, that in itself is a weakness and so the individuals, therefore, will have to start thinking about how I'm contributing to the perpetuation of the absence of those people in those spaces, or I'm only imagining this job can only be held by certain kinds of people. And if I don't rethink that as a person, then I'm contributing to maintaining the system of racism that we've all inherited and by which we've been living.
Thank you very, very much. And for that response, because to me, it really brings to the foreground that whole challenge we have of being able to recognize what is invisible, right? So that we can actually address it. Thank you so much. And another question that we got from the audience is as follows. I have always wondered why race was such a big thing. Why do we specify between skin colors? Can't we just be the human race? It's great to celebrate culture and history, but could we or should we ever come to a point where it is just history and instead just all be one human race?
That's an excellent question. But when human beings come together, we're going to we're going to use different kinds of things about us to differentiate each other. And therefore, you know, sometimes it's going to be height, sometimes it's going to be any number of things that, and race has been something that has long, and we can go back to the discussion of how race started and how it was used to differentiate human beings from each other. And so I won't go into that historical background, but let's acknowledge then that the societies have always operated on the basis of race, but it's not that nothing's wrong in seeing race. It's how we interpret and operationalize race, because race is a social construct. We know in the Canadian context that when Europeans came, certain races of people were seen as races not for them not to come. So race is not necessarily only at the beginning based on if you're not white, because as we would know, the Jews were seen as a different race of people, and therefore they were not enabled or allowed. And you can look into Canadian history, Canadian immigration history, about how Jews were treated. And you would have read the book None is Too Many. Again, they were seen as a different race of people. There's also a book called How the Irish Became White. You know, so how race was operating with also income, etc., etc. So we have that. But in modern society, where we have race, if you look back at Canadian immigration policy, you would know that the Canadian immigration policy deliberately sought to keep racialized people, namely Africans, despite Africans being here since 1608 and 1624, the immigration policy deliberately attempted to keep Africans out. We know that South Asians were not welcomed in Canada. We know that Asians were not welcome except to be on the railroad, and then they came as men, and then hopefully they would go back. And if you notice, even the history of Calgary and Asians' establishment in the Calgary and in Edmonton in Alberta, we would see how race was used, and this is seeing them in relation to white. So it's not to say let's wish away race. It's for us to start thinking, how do we recognize that it's a social construct and we are party to maintaining it, and therefore we are party to change it? And how are we going to change it? It's to also work hard to challenge the structures. And I mean the structures, not the individual races, yes, the individual race is a reflection of that, but to challenge the structures. You know, for example, during the Olympics that we had last year, I was noticing how who was seen as Canadian and how certain athletes were referred to in terms of their skin color while others weren't, and how Canadian is used to refer to some people based on skin color and not others. So we have to see how race is operationalized and how we're going to constantly root it out of the system. But you know, we can talk about it. I can say much of what I want to say about it, but it's going to take action, and action from governments and for every one of us.
Thank you very much for that wonderful response. And also the audience members, thank you so much for those wonderful questions, because this is the unlearning that we need to do. This is the journey that we need to be on. I know I'm cognizant of the time, and so I'm going to ask one last question before we go into the next one, and I hope we'll be able to wrap it up in the next 3 to 4 minutes. So the question is, How can allies show support? How can privileged people use their privilege to help?
Excellent question, and I appreciate that question. And yes, you see, the journey towards anti-racism cannot be attained, cannot be walked on by only racialized people. And racialized people and indigenous people should not necessarily always be in the educator role to teach others that that they're doing. And you know, the point is, when you talk about allies have to understand why they're doing things. Allies have to also be ready to be challenged. Allies will also have to be ready to think of how they become complicit at times. And allies have to be ready to lose some of the privileges that sometimes is so difficult to give up. So being an ally and allyship would mean really working hard at seeing what I'm willing to do if I'm going to be an ally. It's not about simply making space for that some other person, but sometimes it means you move in order to make space for that other person. It also means that, you know, when hiring is done and you're privileged as an ally to be offered the position, to also point to how, yes, but no racialized people is in this position, no Black person is in the position, therefore we should seek to have those people, because ultimately whatever we do and whatever the ally does benefits him, her, or them once these contributions are made. Again, what we're talking about here, Canada would not be Canada today without the contribution of everyone, including Black people.
Thank you very much, Dr. James, for that wonderful response, for answering all the questions. And audience members, thank you so much for your insightful questions. And I'm sure there are many more questions that are coming in. Please keep the questions coming in. Send them to askus@calgary.ca, and we will also do our best to use the questions to continue our journey and use those questions as well in creating further discussions. And I hope that the answers that were provided by our keynote speaker, Dr. James, can help us continue on our journey as an anti-racist organization and city. So this concludes the question and answer session. Now I would like to invite our next speaker, Nicole Dodd, and allow me to say a few words about Nicole. Nicole is the Service Design Lead, Diverse and Inclusive Services at the Calgary Public Library. She has an MBA from the University of Calgary with a capstone in diversity and inclusion. In June 2020, she co-founded an anti-racism initiative called Alberta Anti-Racism EDU, advocating to the Minister of Education to add anti-racism coursework and Black Canadian history to Alberta's K-12 curriculum. She is a passionate champion for inclusion, equity, and anti-racism. In her free time, Nicole likes to cross-country ski, use her Peloton bike, and travel. We are humbled to have you here, Nicole. Over to you.
Thank you, Fizal. Good afternoon, and on behalf of the library, it's my pleasure to participate in this event for Black History Month. Thank you, Dr. James, for sharing some very important Black history facts in your talk. 2 points that really resonated with me were that Black History Month is not the only time to discuss the circumstances and history of Black Canadians, as well as we should really think about Black History Month differently and use it as an opportunity to move our society towards an anti-racist future. So at the library, Black History Month is a celebration of honoring the cultures, histories, and contributions of Black Albertans and the Afro diaspora. And Black History Month recognition represents the library's commitment to its strategic priority of inclusion. So I just wanted to promote a few other things that the library is doing for Black History Month. So tomorrow, actually, you can join us in screening Cheryl Fogo's John Ware Reclaimed documentary at 7 p.m. And all month long, please check out calgarylibrary.ca to enjoy virtual programs and explore free resources to learn about the lived experience of prominent Black Albertans and Calgarians. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicole, for that wonderful and inspirational message. The Calgary Public Library is a repository of knowledge, and Nicole, you are a repository of knowledge, wisdom, and expertise. Just to think of what you have done in that one short year, it's unbelievable. Thank you once again. I would like to take the opportunity to remind our audience members that in partnering with Calgary Public Library, we have access to several Black History Month events that can be accessed via the History's website as well as the Calgary Public Library website. And this is important to repeat because, as people say, history repeats itself. So it's important to repeat that message that these events are coming up. And as Nicole mentioned, there's the John Ware Reclaimed virtual documentary screening tomorrow. On February 14th, we have Teaching African History with Dr. George Sefadai, and it will also be hosted in collaboration with the Anti-Racism Program. We have on February 15th, a day later, We Are the Roots, Black Settlers and Their Experiences of Discrimination on the Canadian Prairies. And also on February 28th, on the last day of this Black History Month, we'll have Mental Health of Black Canadians and Black Immigrants in Alberta. And this session will have the keynote speaker, Dr. Bukola Salami, and it will also be co-hosted in collaboration with Calgary Public Library, as well as, of course, the City of Calgary's Anti-Racism Program. I would like to introduce our last speaker, Councillor Evan Spencer, who will give us the closing statement. Allow me to say these tantalizing facts about Councillor Evan Spencer. Evan Spencer is a passionate and experienced community advocate, emerging policy nerd, I didn't know that was a thing, family man, and a great neighbor. Evan lives and plays in Ward 12 as a father to 2 kids, husband, and volunteer. Evan met his supportive, caring, and compassionate wife, Anna, in college, and they were married in 2008. They are the proud parents of Micah, 10. Hello, Micah. Hope you're watching. And Sarah, 8. Sarah, you're great. Evan has dedicated his adult life to building community. A born and raised Calgarian, Evan was fortunate to have 2 loving parents who modeled hard work and genuine care for others. This upbringing instilled in Evan strong values and ultimately set him on the path of servant leadership and community advocacy. Welcome, Councillor Spencer.
Thank you, Faisal. I appreciate that, and it's been a privilege to be here today. I wanted to start by just saying thank you, Dr. James, for sharing your wisdom and your expertise with us today in celebration of Black History Month. That last question and answer was particularly poignant and will sit with me. It's really eye-opening to be reminded of the path that we still yet need to take to understand and reckon with the complete history of our country, our city, and community, including the contributions and the challenges of the Black community. This is a learning journey for me, and I'm striving to continually put myself in a position to learn and to grow in serving the community. Like many of you, my education did not include our country's full history. Much of my life has been spent unaware of the continued prevalence of racism in Canada, and I've always been a community builder surrounded by a large, seemingly inclusive community. Because of this, and because it didn't impact me or it didn't seem to affect me, I was unaware of its impact on my racialized and Indigenous friends, and I assumed that racism was not a daily issue for me. It's taken me years to begin to understand systemic racism, to unpack what we've been taught in schools was not a full nor an accurate representation of Canada's history, and that much of the written history, as well as the systems and policies that govern our country, were created with a singular white perspective, and as such continue to oppress Indigenous and racialized communities. That my version of Canada is flawed and damaging to those whose histories have been erased or misrepresented. We need to fill in the gaps in our city and in our country's collective history and acknowledge that our work has only just begun. In the 2020 Calgary public hearings, when 130 of our neighbors shared their personal stories, it left a sobering and permanent impact. But the changes that it prompted, while exciting and encouraging, it's just happening now. We have so much work to do. That work is to listen, to learn from local champions and educators like Councillor Courtney Walcott. It's a privilege to be able to do so and to have him as my colleague. I've had an opportunity to meet with the members and the team on the City of Calgary's anti-racism program and the community volunteers serving with the Anti-Racism Action Committee, or ARAC. Those volunteers, most of them from racialized and Indigenous communities themselves, give freely of their time to actively help to make our city anti-racist. But it cannot solely be the responsibility of Dr. James, Councillor Walcott, the City of Calgary Anti-Racism Program, the ARAC volunteers to do the emotional labor of building bridges towards a racially just Calgary. It is the responsibility of all of us with a voice, big or small, to lean and learn the history, to share the stories, and to take actions against racism. Dr. James, our heartfelt gratitude to what you have imparted to us today. Thank you for all that planned and organized today's event. I'm sure it was a lot of work. And to all the staff and members of the public in attendance, I say thank you, and I wish you an excellent rest of your day.
Thank you very much, Councillor Evans-Spencer, for that closing statement. I would also like to thank once again our keynote speaker, Dr. Carl James, for taking the time and graciously sharing your wisdom and expertise with us. A big thank you as well to the Mayor, Your Worship. Thank you so much for that message. Thank you so much, General Manager Katie Black, for your leadership and for the wonderful message you sent us as well. And I also would like to thank the people who are organizing these things behind the scene. I want to thank members of the anti-racism program team, Nadia Haynes, Dr. Abisola Oyasiji, Dr. Linda Konyatiman. I want to thank members of the Calgary Public Library. So many folks at the city have worked tirelessly to ensure that this event takes place. And as you can see, this is the opening event of the Black History Month, but it is not the last event. And we have had the opportunity today to take a moment and ask difficult questions, and hopefully the answers we received have set us on a journey of self-discovery for some of us, and also a journey of coming together and healing as a community, as a city, as an organization. And some of the questions that were raised had a lot of that in it, that not so much how do we move past this, but how do we really truly come together and heal? And even the questions regarding race, questions, why can't we be just one human race? I may be interpreting much in it, but I believe in my heart that how people come to that place is oftentimes the desire to see people coming together, the desire to see the city coming together. And the anti-racism program of the City of Calgary, our mission really is to mitigate and remove systemic racism within the organization, in the community, and the city. And this is in part of the commitment of the city to dismantling systemic racism. We started this session today with a territorial acknowledgement, and I think it is actually really important to close it with acknowledging where we are, acknowledging the importance of the location where we are as Treaty 7, because being on Treaty 7, we have, as Black settlers, as immigrants, but also, of course, as Indigenous people, we have to find ways of coming together to heal. And Black History Month is a month where we start also, or rather continue on that journey. Thank you very much, audience members. Thank you very much, all the presenters, and we wish you a happy Black History Month.